And now our last speaker, Herbert Moldering, is a freelance scholar and professor emeritus of the history of art at Ruhr University in Bochum, Germany. From 1975 to 1978, he served as director of the Westfälischer Kunstverein in Münster, where he produced the exhibition and catalog Charles Simonds' Floating Cities and Other Architectures. In 2014, he co-curated the exhibition Lens-Based Sculpture, the transformation of sculpture through photography at the Berlin Academy of Arts, which also included works by Charles Simonds. A few of his most recent books, of which there are many, are Atelier Man Ray from 2012, Marcel Duchamp at the age of 85, an Incunabulum of Conceptual Photography from 2013, and Duchamp Traversé, 2014. Thank you very much, Professor Moldering.
So, good evening, one can say now. I thank you very much for inviting me to lead you away from Soho to a provincial capital in Germany called Münster in the north of Germany. And I shall talk very much on the same period as Maria, but I shall do it from a subjective perspective. So I shall try to tell you how I, as director of this very young director of the Westphalian Kunstverein, as I have perceived these problems and these actions and all that. The 70s were a decade of fundamental change in the German art scene. Abstract art, which had been defamed and prohibited by the Nazi regime as degenerate art, experienced an unparalleled revival in post-war Germany. It was raised to a veritable ideology of freedom and progress, and anyone who dared call it into question ran the risk of being stamped as an artistic reactionary. Notwithstanding the fact that abstract art, especially its German variant of the 50s and 60s, had meanwhile ossified into mindless formalism. In the early 70s, while doing my research for my thesis on the oeuvre of Marcel Duchamp, I had gained an insight in Duchamp's dislike of painting for its own sake and his strong aversion of the kind of mindless formalism I've just mentioned. It was Duchamp's declared aim to put art back in the service of the mind, in other words, to develop forms of expression that were inspired by philosophy and literature and capable of triggering symbolical and metaphorical ideas. It was precisely in light of this declared aim of Duchamp that I then took a fresh look at the contemporary art scene. In 1976, when I just had been appointed director of the Westphalian Art Society in Münster, a private space for exhibition of modern and contemporary art, and was searching for new forms of art that were more existential and less superficial than works of pure painting, I came across Daniel Abady's small book on Charles Simonds in a Paris bookshop. I was fascinated by Abady's accounts of Simonds' artistic and social activities on the Lower East Side. It was an artistic practice that amounted to much more than the production of commodities for exhibitions, galleries, and art fairs. Simonds' contribution to Documenta 6 in June and July of the following year was precisely the kind of vitally metaphorical art I was searching for and so I decided to ask him whether he would care to exhibit at the Westphalian Art Society. As he was living and working in Berlin at the time on a DAAD grant from the German Academic Exchange Service, it was easy to contact him. By the end of the year, we were able to arrange an exhibition for March-April 78, the focal point of which was to be a new and hitherto unknown aspect of his work, the rearrangeable architectural model of the floating cities. Simonds wrote a fictional catalogue text entitled Floating Cities, Maritime Communities, and produced diagrams and photomontages of possible configurations of these imaginary cities. Besides his presentation in the museum, which comprised photomontages, drawings, and the actual model, on which visitors could freely rearrange the various floating elements of the city using a croupier's rake. There was no globe, no vitrine over it, as in Siegen 2 years ago. There were 2 rakes, so everybody could create his own floating city, spiral, or whatever it was. Simonds also worked in the streets of Münster. So we were very young at this time, you see that? But this work was abandoned after only a few days, as the old part of Münster, which had been almost entirely destroyed by Allied bombs during World War II, was now so completely rebuilt that there were hardly any holes or gaps into which he could have installed his dwellings. The other reason was that an unidentified art collector, probably from the Art Society's own circle, hit upon the idea of tailing him secretly and then stealing at night the dwellings that Simonds had built on windowsills during the day, thus enriching his own art collection. So, running parallel to the exhibition of Simonds' works at the Westphalian Art Society was an exhibition of the German sculptor Nikolaus Lang, whom you have already seen in Maria's presentation, including sculptural explorations of the earth colors of Tuscany that had already been used by the Tuscan artists of the 15th century. I shall be referring to these artists again later on. The exhibition Floating Cities and Other Architectures went from Münster to the Bonn Art Society, where Simonds, in addition to the exhibition, built a large landscape in a shop window on the left, together with children from the locality. The reactions of the press to both exhibitions were positive throughout, just as they had been for Simonds' contribution to Documenta 6 only 6 months before. The art critics lauded Simonds as an ideology-free, forward-looking romantic who, through his participation in concrete projects for improving the living conditions of the people of the Lower East Side, had shown himself to be anything but a nostalgic admirer of ruins. Simonds' exhibition made such a deep impression that 2 of the largest German museums of modern art, the Museum Ludwig in Cologne and the Berlin National Gallery, mounted a further exhibition of Simonds' works only a year later under the title Circles and Towers Growing. The book, entitled Cracking, a fiction by Lucy Lippert based on Simonds' work, was published on the occasion of the exhibition in Cologne and published by the Cologne publisher Walter Koenig, and it served instead as an exhibition catalogue. Simonds' dwellings and his twofold strategy of exhibiting models, objects, and installations in the wide cube of the museum, and at the same time taking his art out into the streets, fascinated the art public not only in capitalist West Germany, but also in socialist East Germany, as evidenced by the exhibition of Simonds' work at the subversive Jürgen Schweinebraten Gallery in East Berlin in the same year as we did it in Münster, so in 1978. Let us now turn to the historical circumstances governing the reception of this kind of art at the end of the 70s in Germany. Two exhibitions left an indelible mark on the art scene in Germany of the 70s, beginning with curator Harry Simonds' exhibition Life in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form, subtitled Works, Concepts, Processes, Situations, Information, which was shown at the Kunsthalle Bern in Switzerland in the spring of 1969, and then at the Kaiser Wilhelm Museum in Krefeld in Germany. Then it went to the ICA in London. The exhibition introduced such new names as Richard Serra, Dennis Oppenheim, Robert Smithson, Richard Long, Eva Hesse, Bruce Naumann, Sarkis, and many others who at that time were still unknown in Germany. The work shown in the exhibition constituted a broadside against the dominance of gestural and geometric expression of pop art and minimal art, and demonstrated how very much the notion of art had changed with the coming of a new generation of artists. And that was only 1 year after we experienced the great shock of the existence of minimal art and pop art at the previous Documenta, at the Documenta of '68. You can't imagine what it meant for young students and professors. There was only one in Germany who was interested in this kind of art. You know, there was one university in Germany in 1968 where you could study modern art. You know, that was in Bochum. And the professor, it should be said to his honor, was Max Imdahl. So it was a big shock. Okay. The main features of the new art were the opposition to the dominance of form in art and the shift of interest away from the art object toward the artistic process itself. A great many artists in the exhibition, like the group of earth artists, were no longer represented with their actual works, but simply with photographic documentations and written information, while others, like the group of concept artists, presented just their concepts in the form of working instructions and waived the need for any actual physical art object. Seemann himself sums up one of the main new tendencies in his catalogue introduction with the words Mother Earth as medium and workplace, the desert as concept. Just as important to us, the new art forms and processes was the fact that some artists, especially the earth artists, sought to break the social triangle studio, gallery, museum within which art operates. It was this extended notion of art achieved through this exhibition that first formed the foil against which the work of Charles Simonds was received in Germany, France, and Italy from 1975 onwards. The new approaches and concepts generated by When Attitudes Become Form were resumed by Seemann on a much broader scale at Documenta 5 of 1972, subtitled Questioning Reality, Pictorial Words of Today. In this exhibition, too, the dominant art forms were no longer paintings and sculptures, but installations, environments, performances, and happenings. What aroused the fiercest opposition among art critics and hence constituted the greatest focus of attention was the presentation of the exhibition section on the attic floor of the Fridericianum Museum, in which, under the banner of individual mythologies, Simonds had gathered together several artists who had staged disturbing, mystico-religiously inspired, and hence altogether unmodern visual worlds. Among the sensations in this section were Paul Tick's installation, Arc Pyramid, Ed Kinol's Anti-Racist Environment, 5-Car Stud, and Marion Zazila's Dreamhouse installation and performance with music by La Monte Young. The exhibitions, When Attitude Become Form, 69, and Documenta 5, 72, meant the definite end of the idea of a modern, uniform style of life. The idea had last been nourished by Documenta 4 of 1968, which had marked the triumph of pop art and minimal art. The realization that only a plurality of personal attitudes is possible was now gaining more and more acceptance. The framework of the individual mythologies was extended in 1974 by the Paris-based German critic Günther Metken. You heard already a lot about him, with the exhibition Spurensicherung, Archaeology and Memory at the Hamburg Art Society and the Lenbach House in Munich. The German word Spurensicherung, you asked the question, cannot be translated by a single word, by one single word. It refers to all methods of securing evidence, including forensics. Therefore, forensic, the translation is correct. But it means also all processes of excavation in archaeology, the collecting of objects and myths in ethnography and historical science. This word, Spurensicherung, is very open. It has even a kind of poetical resonance. And that is the reason why this word was a powerful instrument in the second half of the 70s. For example, the influence of this artistic movement created, constructed, invented by Günther Metken was so strong that a collection of articles of Carlo Ginzburg, the famous Italian historian, in 1979 was without, there was no basis in the Italian title, was titled in the German translation Spurensicherung. And then the first book, first anthology of Ginzburg's, a collection of Ginzburg's article in 1980 also, which was published by the famous Wagenbach publishing house in Berlin, was also titled Spurensicherung. So it became a key word for all these techniques in the humanities of securing evidence. But absolutely, Mrs. Maria has explained all that with the focus on the physicality of and the materiality of the evidence. The exhibition in Munich and in Hamburg showed the works of the Parisian artists Didier B., Christian Boltonski, Claudio Costa, and Patrick Poirier, the Swiss object artist Jürgen Brotwolf, and the already mentioned German sculptor Nikolaus Lang. What united these artists was the skepticism toward the consumer optimism of the pop era and the depersonalization of art by the minimalists, both of which were expressions of the enthusiasm for progress and technology that pervaded American and European society. Inspired by ethnology and anthropology, these artists turned their gaze back to human beings, to their everyday myths and rituals, to their emotional and archetypical commonalities. An important crystallization point of this human-oriented and life-oriented art were the writings of the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. His two books, Triste Tropique and The Savage Mind, were must-reads for every artist and intellectual in Germany around 1970. Mythical, or as Lévi-Strauss called it, savage thinking, which for decades had been ousted from the art world by the anti-language and anti-literature aesthetics of pure painting, had since 1970 been exercising a great attraction on artists. Being an analog kind of thinking, a thinking in images, it is congenial with the artistic imagination. Lévi-Strauss' argument of the modernity of savage thinking was amplified by the study, quote, dream time, concerning the boundary between wilderness and civilization of the German ethnographer Hans-Peter Dürr of 1977. We are always in this period, 77, 78. The only bestseller of German language cultural anthropology. It contained a sharp critique of the pretended singularity and dominance of European rationalism and defended the idea that cyclical forms of structuring life and belief are as valid as the progress models of time of modernity. So Metken's work of bringing together anthropologically minded artists culminated in 1977 in the exhibition section at Documenta 6, curated by Metken himself. We heard it already, entitled Subjective Sciences or the Archaeology of the Humane, in which not only the artists of the Hamburg and Munich exhibition of 1974 were represented, but also a further group of artists that included Charles Simonds, who had modeled a large installation in the Kassel exhibition. And then published in good time for the exhibition was Metken's book, which was already presented here. In a recent, that's so far some facts concerning the framework of reception of Simonds' work between 75 and 78 in Germany. In a recent, now I shall finish with some personal remarks how I perceived his work over the years. In a recent publication titled The Legends of Charles Simonds, I came across the following assertion, quote, he, Simonds, was never interested in using his art to send a message in a bottle. The stories of the little people are so open from a literary point of view that they contain no real message, end of quote. I do not know whether Simonds intended to use his art to send a message in a bottle, but I would say he did send one. Precisely his fictive ethnography entitled Three Peoples contained many real messages, as did the dwellings and the moving of art from the studio into the street. Here I would like to concentrate on just one message that I believe I have received from them. It concerns a completely new concept of time. It was very interesting to follow your contribution and others. It seems that there is something coming from these pieces of charts disturbing concerning renewing our ideas on time. In his text, Three Peoples and the accompanying ritual architectures, Simonds plays with the possibilities of different concepts of time, concepts that structure civilizations differently in the way they live, build, and dwell. Of the three peoples, the one caught up in the building spiral seems, in terms of its concept of time, to be most like those societies of our own time that are determined by economic discourse and guided by such assumptions as progress, improvement, growth, or upward movement. It is this people that is by far the most alienated from nature, from the earth, obsessed as it is with its technological possibilities that drive it from one catastrophe to the next. The Three Peoples fiction and its vivid imagery were indeed a highly imaginative calling in question of the quantitatively structured progress model of modernity, a model that had been publicly discredited by the study of the Club of Rome on the future of the world economy, entitled The Limit of Growth, published in 1972. But that's not all. The Three Peoples was also a groundbreaking attempt at rethinking the notion of time that has hitherto been central to all historico-philosophical concepts. Ever since the 1980s, cultural, social, and historical scientists have been deeply concerned with the different shapes of time in different cultures and in different historical epochs. Mention should at least be made here of the studies of Johannes Fabian, Stephen Kern, Graham Burnett, and the British social scientist Barbara Elizabeth Adam, who founded the journal Time and Society in 1992. Through his vivid imagination as an artist, Charles Simonds had already anticipated a good decade before the relativizing approach to modernity's concept of time, an approach that was now central to the said studies. This topic alone would constitute the subject matter of a special and much longer lecture, but the following few remarks, which are based on the writings of Achim Landwehr, the leading German scholar of historical time theory, will have to suffice in the present context. The idea of time moving forward in one single direction is a child of the so-called modern era that began with the Renaissance of the 16th century and was based on the equating of the passage of time with the time of the clock, while suppressing numerous other possible forms of time. To quote French philosopher Michel Serres, we conceive of time as an irreversible line of acquisitions and inventions. We go from generalizations to discoveries, leaving behind us a trail of errors finally corrected. This scheme allows us permanently to be not only right, but to be righter than was ever possible before, end quote. It is in this time model that the adjacent existence of different cultures is defined as non-simultaneity, and the different-minded culture as the relic of an overcome past and hence not contemporary. in his groundbreaking 1983 study, Time and the Other, How Anthropology Makes Its Object, Johannes Fabian clearly shows how ethnology has, since the end of the 19th century, contributed toward making the temporalization of civilizations and life forms and the allocation of non-simultaneities one of the main constituents of European colonialism. Ethnology has, writes Fabian, contributed to the intellectual legitimization of colonial undertakings inasmuch as it has established the notion of a natural, or to be more precise, an evolutionary time scale. His central argument concludes that ethnology tends toward a denial of coevalness of the constitutive other. It was not least this concept of time that allowed European immigrants to allocate the indigenous peoples of North America to another temporal space that belonged to the past of what was supposedly an evolution of mankind. Indeed, this conceptual model of non-simultaneity enabled European immigrants to secure the temporal monopoly over the social cultural present. Naturally, this concerned not only American but also non-European civilization and cultures across the entire planet. A good decade before, cultural, social, and historical scientists had begun to deconstruct this time model. Charles Simonds had reintegrated into the urban present of New York model-like dwellings reminiscent of the houses of the Pueblo Indians. These dwellings are not historical documents, not reconstructions of bygone forms of dwelling, but pure constructs of the contemporary artist Charles Simonds' imagination. And as such, they exist in the same time as he himself and in the same time as the urban neighborhoods in which they make their appearance. Symbolically, Simonds gives them back their coevalness. And that is precisely why his works and actions are not those of a nostalgic dreamer. Back in the 1970s, when Simonds spent days on end building dwelling places for an imaginary civilization of little people in the rundown neighborhoods of New York, Paris, Berlin, or Genoa, the impression he made was one of a, I think you said it yourself, crazy artist, out of touch with present-day reality. Through the new discourse among historical scientists on all the possible different shapes of time, Charles Simonds has become a highly contemporary figure. Precisely by reason of his non-simultaneity, the artist Charles Simonds, working in the modern cities of today, is as contemporaneous as one could possibly be. So whenever I read or hear the assertion that our form of temporality is no longer adequate, whether in a social, historical, art historical, or cultural historical context, I cannot help thinking of the different timescapes described in the fiction of the three peoples and molded in the ritual architectures. I have come to realize that the idea contained in them, namely that of the plurality and layering of different constructs of time, was one of the messages, initially enigmatic yet lastingly impressive, that I received almost 40 years ago when I first took interest in the work of Charles Simonds. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Well, that doesn't at all mean that we can't continue the conversation across the hall in the Loeb Room. First, I would just like to sincerely thank all of our speakers whose really wonderful presentations today exceeded my very high expectations in terms of their eloquence, their variety, and how much they've contributed to our understanding of Charles Simonds. So thank you again to all our speakers today.